Well, welcome to the American Academy. So many familiar faces in the room tonight. It's really great. Alexandra, you brought everyone we know out, apparently. My name's RJ McGill. I'm the head of communications here at the American Academy and the editor of our Berlin Journal. I'm going to give a quick introduction to the introducer and also to the fellowship, and then I'll hand over the floor. Tonight's fellowship is the Mary Ellen van der Heyden Fellowship that Alexandra Kleeman has. And it was established in 2007 with the purpose of bringing outstanding novelists and fiction writers to Berlin. The fellowship was endowed in perpetuity in 2009 and initiated by Karl van der Heyden, a native Berliner, founding trustee of the American Academy, its treasurer for over a decade, and the Academy's co-chairman from 2009 to 2011. And his granddaughter's in the audience. Just saying. Karl and Mary Ellen have long been committed to philanthropy, founding a library, an art center, a fellowship at their alma mater, Duke University, in addition to significant endowments elsewhere, most prominently at the New York Public Library's Coleman Center for Scholars and Writers. Our Mary Ellen van der Heyden Fellowship recognizes Mary Ellen's lifelong passion for fiction and has made possibility the residencies of outstanding writers such as Laurie Moore, Jonathan Lethem, Lance Samantha Chang, Brian Evanson, and now, of course, Alexandra Kleeman, who we're really glad to have as a fellow this semester. And a little backstory, Alexandra was accepted as a fellow, I think, 2020, roughly. And so I feel like I've been waiting to do this introduction for 5 years because she was accepted. Then we ran a story of hers in the Berlin Journal in the anticipation that she would be there, and then we had a pandemic, and that never came to fruition. So welcome, finally, this semester to the American Academy. I'll say a brief few words about the introducer, Theresia Enzensberger. As you know, a central part of the work that we do at the Academy is fostering connections between our fellows and Berlin-based scholars and writers and professionals with whom they can exchange ideas. And so this evening, we're thrilled to welcome Berlin writer and journalist Theresia Enzensberger, whom Alexandra has enjoyed getting to know during her fellowship for the last few months. Theresia will then introduce Alexandra and then join her on stage for a Q&A afterwards. To you. Theresia Enzensberger, not yet, not quite yet. She writes essays, reportage, and reviews for publications including the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung, Die Zeit, Monopol, and Delphi magazine, among others. After studying film at Bard College in New York, she went on to found Block, a magazine featuring young German voices. Her first novel, Blaupause, in English Blueprint, was published in 2017 and became a national bestseller, was translated into English and Italian, and won the Alfred Döblin Medal. Her second novel, At Sea, follows Yada, a young girl raised in a floating utopian city on the Baltic Sea. Nominated for the 2022 German Book Award, the novel, as I'm sure you'll hear later, explores themes that resonate closely with those found in Alexandra's own work. Ms. Enzensberger's most recent publication, Sleeping, is partly fictional, partly essayistic, and it all together comes together to explore the topic of insomnia and sleep, which will not be happening tonight because we'll be very, very alive and awake. So thank you for being here tonight and for introducing Alexandra. A few housekeeping remarks before we get started. Alexandra's talk will last about 35 minutes. She and Theresia will go onto the stage for Q&A. If you're here in the room, just simply raise your hand and a colleague will come around with a microphone. If you're joining us online in Vimeo, just type your questions into the chat. And with that, the floor is yours.
Thank you for this introduction. Hi. Tonight, I have the honor of introducing Alexandra Kleeman, who's giving the Mary Ellen van der Heyden lecture. And she's going to talk about what it means to be writing toward a post-capitalist world. And she's going to talk about her new novel, The Taxon Cycle. As a writer, sometimes you read an article or a book by another author and you feel an instant kinship with them. It's usually not about style. That's something to admire, something that differentiates. Writing can be a lonely profession, and the trajectory of one's interests can feel random and erratic. So there's something deeply comforting, even magical, about finding a writer that deems similar things important. I felt this more than 10 years ago when I read a reportage Alex wrote for N+1 about a raw food festival where she investigates nutritional fads, the inner logic of cults, and the cultish logic of consumer culture, all the while being surrounded by durian extremists. Reading more of Alex's work made me fall in love with the way she thinks about the artificial and the natural, about the organization of communities, about celebrity, catastrophe, and crisis. Her debut novel, You Too Can Have a Body Like Mine, is a tale of 3 people who get entangled in a world that is full of the horror of the mundane and at the same time looks nothing like ours. Creating a world that sits slightly askew, that looks back at us, illuminating the insanity of her culture, is one of Alex's great talents. This is also apparent in her latest novel, Something New Under the Sun, where the embattled everyman, Patrick, goes to Los Angeles to help with the adaptation of his novel, or so he thinks. It's a world where water has been replaced by a substance called water, and constant wildfires form the unnerving backdrop to the artifice that is the entertainment industry. The book jumps across genre boundaries, but it also breaks down time. It tricks us into thinking that it's about the future when really it's terrifyingly contemporary. There won't be enough time to list all of Alex's accomplishments, but let me just add to the ones I already mentioned that she's also an associate professor at Cornell University and a contributing writer at the New York Times Magazine. Her work has received numerous awards, for example, the Bard Fiction Prize, the Rome Prize, the Berlin Prize, and the Guggenheim Fellowship in Fiction. There is a deadpan surrealism in Alex's writing that is as frightening as it is hilarious. With sharpness and imagination, she invents distances from which to gaze at old problems anew. I think this is something that makes her uniquely qualified to take on this new project that she'll be telling us about tonight, and that she herself calls tentatively utopian, which I think is very brave. I'm so excited to hear her thoughts on post-capitalist writing, and I feel privileged in knowing that we'll get a preview of hearing what her new book is about. And now I'll give the floor to her. Please welcome Alexandra Kleeman.
Thank you so much, Theresia. I don't know. I feel so lucky to be here. I feel so lucky to have met Theresia. It's like finding someone who's been operating on the same weird wavelength as you in a totally different place. Her book on insomnia, seasteading, architecture, you'll see a lot of these same things come up in here. Or not the insomnia, but there was insomnia that I had while working on it, for sure. So thank you for joining me here today. Thank you to the staff who've made this such a calm and nourishing place to work. It truly is a one-of-a-kind place. And thank you to my fellow fellows and their partners who are so inspiring in the work they do, and who've been so generous in sharing suggestions for research, from books on family abolition, the Port Royal experiment, islandology, and the novel about ants. You all know who you are. And thank you above all for humoring me and coming to listen to a talk about utopia at a moment that is more dystopian than most. And for opening your mind to the idea of a project that dreams of a margin outside of capitalism, pre, post, and off to the side, at a time when these possibilities feel perhaps particularly difficult to imagine. I'm here to talk about the project I'm working on, The Taxon Cycle, a novel in 5 parts, each of which takes place on a different island in a different time of the past or the future. But first, I would like to talk a little bit about scurvy. Scurvy was a disease that characterized the age of long-haul sea voyages, where sailors began for the first time to navigate routes where they would not sight land for months at a time. In this sense, scurvy was a disease of exploration, and by extension, a disease linked to the work of colonization. Setting off on journeys that might last years, men of all ages, backgrounds, and levels of health would succumb. Sometimes entire crews perished. Many of the symptoms were physiological. Gums blackened, teeth grew loose. Old wounds opened up and bones creaked, clattered, and turned black. But other symptoms were psychological, spiritual, or even poetic. Sailors with scurvy became acutely nostalgic. They became homesick. They longed to sight land, and they wept at the very thought of it. They often hallucinated the pleasures of land, thinking that they were smelling flowers or fresh green grass from out in the middle of endless salt water. People's minds became as loose and unsteady as their teeth, wrote naturalist George Steller. The irony, as they went about missions that would take them unimaginably far from the world they knew, was that they suffered too from the decision to sever themselves from home. Today we know that scurvy is caused by a deficiency in vitamin C. Without it, the body begins to unravel. James Lind is credited with discovering the cure for scurvy, but in fact the same remedies that were key to combating the disease, fresh oranges and lemons and preserved lemon juice, had been known 200 years earlier, used for a while, then forgotten. Lind's own recommendations were themselves enthusiastically adopted and then slowly lost, as expensive citrus juice was gradually replaced by cheap malt wort, which has nothing to do with vitamin C. The cure for scurvy was discovered and lost and rediscovered again and again, which feels to me like an apt metaphor for the civilizing process, a process of fits and starts and loose blackening teeth. After all, the quickest and simplest and also cheapest cure for scurvy would have been to simply stay home and leave the people of those lands unbothered. I bring up scurvy, a disease of discovery that was itself propelled by the capital invested in discovering new markets and new resources, because it has shaped my project in two ways. First, the story of scurvy's cure, which is full of forward and backward motion, is one that contradicts the supposed progression of the world from ignorance to awareness. It prompts us to ask ourselves, what else have we forgotten? What possible solutions have we foreclosed without realizing we do so? What necessary nourishment are we not getting from the world we've built around us? Frederic Jameson famously declared that it is easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. But perhaps it's not impossible to imagine the end of capitalism. Perhaps we've only forgotten how. More importantly for my work as a novelist, there's a notion of spiritual starvation here that I find fascinating. Long-haul ships were well supplied, their holds were filled with food and drink, and yet they still lacked something unidentified and essential without which life cannot take place. The mind of a sailor registered this lack, the way in which serving the nation's economic interests meant becoming sick and alienated from your own survival, which you could read as a painful, aching desire for unalienated life. But how can we create a desire for something we do not know we are lacking? The Taxon Cycle is my fourth book, and all three of my previous ones dealt with various ends of the world and with American capitalism and consumerism. But it was when I was completing my most recent novel, a climate change story called Something New Under the Sun, that I began to hunger for other ways of living. I was writing in the midst of one disaster, a pandemic, while three of the largest wildfires in Colorado history burned outside my window. On the one hand, I was seeing how rapidly life at the individual and societal level could be reorganized. And on the other hand, I was seeing how much remained stubbornly the same in the face of disasters that only foreshadowed larger disasters. I wanted to respond to Jameson's challenge. What writer doesn't love to bite off more than they can chew? But I also wanted to take seriously the reasons why one might wish to imagine the end of capitalism or an outside to it. It's not only that many are immiserated and endangered under the current conditions of global capital, or that wealth inequality is greater than ever, but that in the United States in particular, socially progressive ideas that are common in places like Europe or Scandinavia, like universal health care, are treated by both parties as radical. The horizon of possibility under capitalism has grown narrower and narrower, and we need to think of alternatives in order to know what to demand of our leaders and what to long for ourselves. Potawatomi writer and botanist Robin Wall Kimmerer has an essay that talks about strawberries and how the process of extracting more profit from growing them has led to bland, tasteless supermarket fruit that barely resembles a ripe, fresh strawberry that you pluck from the stem. Always on fruit. People have grown wary of the sour taste in their mouths. Sorry about that. A great longing is upon us to live again in a world made of gifts, she writes. I've written novels in the past that have been powered by apprehension, by alienation, or fear. But I believe the moment we're in calls for literature driven by the longing for a better world, a glimpse of what that might look like. Literature, after all, is a technology for cultivating and shaping desire. We still live in the regime of love and courtship inaugurated by troubadour poetry. We escape into fiction out of a longing to taste another world or to experience our own more fully. So I gave myself the assignment of channeling my own longing into the writing of a loosely, cautiously utopian novel. But what does this mean today? Most examples of utopian fiction come from the far past, a genre defined by fictional ideal worlds in which they are set. Sir Thomas More's 1516 Utopia, which put the term into common use, takes place on a man-made island where property is communal and gold is made undesirable by being used for things like chamber pots and the shackles of criminals. There's also Francis Bacon's 1626 New Atlantis, a scientific and Christian utopia in the Pacific Ocean, and Edward Bellamy's 1888 Looking Backward, where a banker from 1887 is hypnotized and wakes up in the year 2000 in a futuristic socialist Boston. As a critique of the political structures of their time, something for a history or political theory syllabus, these works succeed. But in terms of moving the reader, making their utopias feel tangible, or shifting the horizon of possibility, I'm not sure. Each follows a similar script. A newcomer goes on a smooth and frictionless tour around this ideal society, expressing amazement as they learn about how well the place functions. There are ideas, world building, and characters, but a lack of story. The no places they explore are oddly isolated from flux and change. They appear fully formed, politically mature, and absolutely conflict-free. If conflict is mentioned, it is safely summarized and left in the past, as in this section from Bellamy's Looking Backward. Such a stupendous change as you describe, said I, did not, of course, take place without great bloodshed and terrible convulsions. On the contrary, replied Dr. Leet, there was absolutely no violence. The change had been long foreseen. Public opinion had become fully ripe for it, and the whole mass of the people was behind it. There was no more possibility of opposing it by force than by argument. On the other hand, the popular sentiment toward the great corporations and those identified with them had ceased to be one of bitterness, as they came to realize their necessity as a link, a transition phase in the evolution of the true industrial system. Unconvincing fictions put the idea of a better world even more firmly out of reach. When we say the word utopia today, we know we mean something ideal, but something also unrealistic, impossible, a pie-in-the-sky fantasy. We may not know how to build a more ideal society, but we all know that it will not come about fully formed, whole and smooth as an egg. Even a better world would not be without its disappointments, frustrations, and tensions. This is what it means to dwell in a place, rather than pass through it as a tourist. And even now, better worlds can be glimpsed within our imperfect one. Foucault referred to heterotopias, pockets of differently organized life that give a glimpse of alternative reality. You could think of a gay bar, Foucault's own example, a neighborhood mutual aid organization, Or a co-housing community like this one, where homeowners began taking down the fences that separated their yards from one another and creating communal spaces in their garages. Even a disaster zone. In Rebecca Solnit's A Paradise Built in Hell, she describes ways that people return to behavior that is altruistic, communitarian, and imaginative in the wake of a disaster. She calls this our default setting. It's tempting to ask why, if you fed your neighbors during the time of the earthquake and fire, you didn't do so before or after, Solnit adds. So utopia and dystopia are deeply intertwined, not just because, for example, the utopia of an ultra-wealthy tech tycoon is a dystopia for the rest of us, but because intolerable conditions create the need for escape. And the extreme possibilities of utopia and dystopia are most apparent on islands, where localized causality can exert a totalizing effect. The resort utopias of Bora Bora and Majorca, if they are utopias to you, have their counterpoint in islands like Nauru, off the coast of Queensland, that was rich in natural fertilizer left by migrating birds. You can actually see every place that doesn't have trees is a place that was mined for fertilizer. At one point, Nauru had the second highest per capita wealth of the entire world. But when all of the fertilizer was extracted, Nauru became an impoverished place, 80% wasteland. Today, it leases its land to Australia for use as an off-site detainment center for asylum seekers. It's easy to imagine a different outcome for Nauru, a place that visitors once named Pleasant Island. For this reason, it seemed important to me to consider multiple sites, situations, and outcomes. I decided on 5 novellas and sites from the past and future. I began to imagine the structure of this book as an island chain in and of itself, in the sense of Caribbean philosopher Edward Glissant, who wrote about how all the world is turning archipelagic. No one place is a lone desert island anymore. Increasingly, they are bound together by common problems. But they are only common problems if we choose to dwell together rather than sail alone. Martinican philosopher Malcolm Ferdinand writes, whoa, how did I do that? Oh, okay. The unconcerned sailor navigates the earth with a perception of the world that is desensitized to others. They do not taste the food of poor people, do not smell the stench of industrial plants in their sights. They do not touch the skin that has been turned cold by misery, do not see racial and gender discrimination, and do not hear the cries for a world. The unconcerned one's refusal of the world is the abandonment of concern for the other. So here are some of the places where my novel dwells. On an island called Possession. This is an island that James Cook visited on his second journey, where he found the islanders unwilling to trade with him and concluded that they were not capable of ownership. He then claimed their land for England. He wrote, "However, we could know but very little of their customs, as we were never able to form any connections with them. They had not so much as touched the things we had left in their huts on purpose for them to take away." So if you imagine this situation, you've got your community, you've got your village, you've got your home, and strange objects are appearing in them. Like, this is a ghost story. Okinawa, in a small village during World War II, where a group of villagers began to meet to imagine a tower designed to foster peace. Manhattan, in a flooded city where a billionaire living in a luxury skyscraper bunker struggles to maintain control over his staff. Fura, otherwise known as Bergman's Island, a Swedish island in the future that has returned to subsistence farming and communalism. And finally, elsewhere, on a distant planet where an operator of mining drones becomes obsessed with an archive of arcane Earth knowledge. I'm going to read now from the 4th section of this novel, which is set more than a generation after a global economic collapse. The residents have reorganized themselves around the principle, a completely obvious one, that it is a society's purpose to house and feed people, no matter who they are. All houses must be fully occupied. All visitors receive free lodging and food, and vegetables and fruits that are harvested are deposited in the communal pantry. If someone in your household passes away, you can either find a new person on your own to take their spot, or you can have the council assign someone. In the section I'm going to read, you'll meet a character named Claude, whose mother, a refugee from a Southern Hemisphere island nation, passed away a year earlier. Because she's grieving, she's able to apply for 3-month extensions to avoid having to clean out her mother's things and release them for others to take. But then a stranger from the mainland with its archaic economic concepts shows up, and she's obliged to house him as he works to establish commerce and trade on the island. He's also determined to get her to fall in love with him. Ooh, conflict. I heard the knock and found Lars from the council standing there looking uncomfortable. He probably didn't pay many visits as people found themselves coming to him for advice on testimony, for getting a favor. He had a basket of apples in his hands, which he handed to me without even saying hello. Then he asked if he could come in. I waved him through. He stood in my front room like a bull in its stall. "You haven't changed anything," he said, looking around. "Not even the portrait on your mantel." "Why would I asked. "Do you know something wrong with it?" "I came here when I was a child," Lars said abruptly, surprising me. "Your mother would look after me on weekends when my father was out on the boat and my mother had her fevers. I remember being very warm on those days, sitting and feeling sleepy and listening to the sound coming from the next room of the spoon rounding the inside of the pot. I didn't mention it earlier. It's nobody's business but mine, and maybe yours." I eyed him. My mother had never told me this. I thought of Lars and my mother smiling at each other as I lay one room away, a useless baby, knowing nothing of it. "In any case, I'm here about your temporary dweller," he said. "We have a newcomer who needs a home for a couple weeks. You can leave your spare room as it is. They don't expect to be staying long." "It's not a spare room," I told him. "It's my mother's bedroom." Lars said nothing. We looked at each other. Finally, I gave in. There was no telling how long he would tolerate us standing there, stiff as rocks. "It's fine," I said. "They can come as soon as they like. They'll have my bed, and I'll sleep in my mother's room. All I need is to put on some fresh sheets." Outdoors, I could hear the muffled notes of goat bells clanging softly as the goats came nearer and nearer. They would be wanting me to open the stable door for them so they could have their scraps. "I wouldn't leave a stranger alone with her things anyhow," I grumbled to myself. "He won't be a stranger for long," said Lars, smiling. "Some people are strangers all their lives," I said, as I brought out his coat and gave him a small sack full of potatoes to leave with. The next day was Friday, a day on which I rest, and I had a full day's charge in the batteries, so I resolved I would play Atlantis Raiders until the stranger arrived. I pressed the button on the machine, and the little black box began to mutter. The vent on top grew hot with effort. Then, with a clear, soft chime that reminded me of water running from springtime ice, the screen came to life. Pixelated bubbles lifted themselves from the bottom of the bright rectangle to the top, and the title faded in clumsily. I had found the game at the home of Joe Faffo, who was known for bartering with mainlanders. When ships came into port, Joe was the first one at the docks in his brimmed hat, wheelbarrow at his side, to meet whoever was aboard and see what they might give him for what he had. He was known to be good at handling the pushy offlanders with their theatrical style of negotiation. They sought friction and arguments. It made them feel as though they had gotten a good deal, and he was good at playing the role, while the rest of us simply did not have the patience. After he passed, we gathered together as usual for the releasing of his belongings. But inside his home, we found a shocking scene. Everywhere you looked, there was an object, Objects stacked atop objects in meaningless order, the sickly feeling of being so outnumbered by unliving things. There were stacks of shiny metal trays and serving bowls, toasters and laptop computers, shelves full of toy animals and obscure glass, lined up in dizzying rows, a lifetime of hats and clothes and boots so new they still had the gleam on them. I remember my mother wiping away the wetness from her face, saying he must have been in a lot of pain, and it felt like a feeling of her own that she had never noticed it, even though she saw him every week at the library. Everyone agreed it was sad that he had felt the compulsion to hoard so much matter. The elderly tend to do this, someone remarked, when they cannot connect to the people around them, perhaps a sign of dementia. We discussed whether it might be better to simply bury the items, rather than risk their melancholic quality spreading through the rest of the town. But it seemed equally troubling to hide them underground. The ground was where our food came from. So in the end, the door was barricaded, and all the sad matter entombed inside. It felt a bit haunted, even to take such a small, useful thing as a serving spoon. Every time you saw it in your kitchen, you would think of poor Joe and the awful loneliness that must have consumed him in his last days, silently as he struggled helplessly to muffle it with stuff. Even so, I took the video game console with its clunky black body and its dangling handheld screen. The device reminded me of a mother and child, still connected by an umbilical cord. There was vulnerability in the plastic link. You took the screen in both hands, your thumbs on the controls, staring down into what I suppose would be its face. Not so different from an infant or a suckling goat. And perhaps that's why I felt like rescuing it from Joe Fafo's property graveyard, because it was such a creaturely piece of tech. As we left the house, I took a cartridge as well, with a picture of a castle underground, surrounded by fish, dolphins, and sharks. I hadn't had much time to choose, but the Atlantis game appealed to me. I had always wondered what things looked like under the sea to those who lived there. I sat at the base of my mother's old armchair and turned the thing on. The third Atlantis castle shimmered into view on the screen in my hands. I nudged the trackball up, and the little mermaid man began swimming. I headed toward the sea glass doors, shifting left and right to avoid the exploding bubbles that would erode my oxygen levels. And when I was close enough, I struck the doors with a beam from my trident, once, twice, 3 times before the angry guard shark swam up, shooting little balls of plasma at me and reducing my shields to 47%. I thought about taking cover, but the sharks were clumsy with their golden armor, and I charged instead. I charged straight into their midst and whacked them again and again until they burst into a scatter of gold coins, which I collected. Just then, I heard goat bells clanging in the front yard. There was something happening, and it had stirred the beasts up. I paused the game. Beneath the sounds of goats, there was a grumbling like weather drawing nearer. I came around to the window and looked out to the east, and I saw Sven's horses pulling his wagon up the hill. And sitting beside Sven with a mess of luggage, it was the red puffer man from the day before. You could see his ears, pink from the chill, poking from the sides of his shorn head. We on the island wore our hair long. The wagon ground to a halt before my walkway, and then I watched as Sven helped the man painstakingly unload 12 pieces of luggage onto the dirt. My goats went to explore them, testing the latches with their thin black lips. I suppose I didn't want to believe it was true, that this loud visitor from the docks would be the temporary lodger Lars had in mind. I had hoped that it would be some spare ship hand, an old and clammed-up one who would share their chew with me and otherwise avoid conversation. I liked the kind of people who chose to work at sea. They aren't socialites. The man clapped Sven on the back, and then, to my growing horror, he began hauling the first trunk up the walkway of small white stones. The stones squealed as he disarranged them, as he brutalized them. They were stones which I had chosen specially for their beauty. He hauled his luggage up toward my door. I thought of how I should greet him, and I wondered if I could ask him to leave all his baggage in the bedroom so that I would not have to know it was there. Then there was the knock. I opened the door to a man grinning widely at me from a bald-shaven face. With all that pale, smooth skin, he looked like a baby with too heavy a brow. He could have been perhaps 30 years old. He stuck his hand out at me, and seeing that I only stared at it, he pulled it back cheerily. "Claude, is it?" he asked, though he delivered it like a final decision. "My name is Jacob. I'll need some help getting these indoors." He gestured behind him at his small mountain of property. "We're a little short on space in here, I'm afraid," I said apologetically, adding a little extra sweetness to mask my irritation. "Could I put them in with the goats? Out of the weather?" Jacob shook his head. "Delicate equipment," he said jovially, "and valuable. I have to keep it all close by, you understand. Maybe just a hand with the smaller ones, if you would. I shouldn't assume that women lift in your culture." I snorted with all my scorn. I couldn't suppress it. I went outside in my bare feet and inspected the 12 different cases. Then I chose the smallest one there was and carried it in with both hands around the grip, as though it were very heavy. The goats were all watching me, the goats who knew me best, and I could tell they wondered why I was letting a fool make a fool of me. Jacob let out a grunt with every step. I suspected he did it just to make the work seem harder. And after several minutes it was over, and I showed him where his room would be and where he could help himself to some water or some food. And I asked if he would keep his luggage in the room, but he said there wasn't enough space. Then his face lit up. He told me he had something for me. "A welcome gift," he said. And he disappeared into my bedroom, where I heard things being opened and closed. And when he returned, he was carrying in his hand one of those little red objects, which he handed to me with great significance. "A token of gratitude," he said grandly. I looked down. It was a little plastic thing about the width of my palm, fake-colored and pierced at one end by an imperfect circle of metal. On it were written the words, "Nord Import-Export Manufacture, bringing you the world." It seemed useless to me at first, something made for the recycler, but then I thought it might be a piece of terrible jewelry, and I liked it even less. "This plastic junk," I told him, setting it on the table. "We catch a lot of it in our nets. It's a bother for the fishers, and the birds choke on it." "This is virgin plastic," Jacob said. "It's brand new. It never existed before they poured it into the molds for these pieces." He picked it up and held the thing toward me like it was a beautiful flower. "Try to wrap your mind around it. Really give it a try. We live in a fallen world. Everything we have, everything we own, everything we use is only a cracked, broken echo of the world that came before. But you hold in your hands right now something that's never been used by another human being, a genuinely new item, made of new material, made only for you, a sign of all the renewal to come if you accept the hand that I am extending." He had a church-going look in his eye. I knew I needed to interrupt him. "What is it?" I said, and took it from him, jingling faintly. "It's a keychain. You can take all your keys and secure them on the ring, just like this," he explained, miming it. "And it has the name of my business on it, so that you can think of me whenever you lock or unlock your door. It's an old advertising custom from the USA." "And why would you give me this?" I asked. "As a token of goodwill," he replied. I laughed and laughed and laughed with little humor as he watched, uncertain. "Do you see any keys around here? Any locks?" I asked, gesturing around me at everything, this house, this island, this epoch. And he actually looked. I went into my mother's bedroom and shut the door, and I didn't come out until I heard the wren's whistle in the blue morning light. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi.
On. Is this on? Yes. Okay.
Hello?
Is yours on?
Yeah, I think so.
Thanks for giving us some hope in the form of literature. Islands are amazing tools to switch perspective, right? And this is kind of what you do there, like to the offlanders. But then also placing stories in different times, like in the future and the past, the way you do it is a way of doing that. And your last novel was set in California, a place that constantly points towards the future. Now you've spent some time in Berlin, a city that is always talked about in terms of its history. Have you found little pockets of the future in this town?
Pockets of a future I'd like to have, I think. I think it's interesting to be in Berlin because you always feel like you've entered into watching a movie partway through. Like everyone you talk to talks about how Berlin was when they came here or when they grew up here or something. So you're displaced from time in that way. But you're also seeing, I think, some still lively, thriving aspects of cities that I once loved that have had some of that like extra space and looseness squeezed out of them. So I think there are things going on here that feel utopian to me. I was lucky enough to meet Axel, who showed me around Spreefeld, to see a co-housing community that is, really active and vigorous today. And so I think if we talk about heterotopias, Berlin is full of little heterotopic patches, and that gives me some relief.
Some of them stuck in the past. The taxon cycle is a term out of biogeography, right? By an ant, somebody thinking about ants, yeah. Right? And it has 4 stages. Your book has 5 stories. Is there a metaphorical connection, or can you talk about that a little bit?
Well, I'm thinking about the talk that my fellow Justin Torres gave a couple weeks ago, last week actually it was, and it was about the rule of 3. I think there's a completeness to 3, but how do you signify excess, or how do you signify that you're not getting all the possible stories that could be told in this suite? And so 5 was that number for me. Probably would have been better to do 10, but who would read it? So I think to just aim for something that allowed me to sort of put a camera in 5 really different, sometimes contradictory moments in history or in space that would show just how many ways people have found to live in unlivable circumstances or to make a world that they would like to live in out of the world they have.
I'm sure you also have a lot of questions. I'm going to ask one more, and then I'm going to open it up to the audience so you can already think about what you want to ask, Alex. Islands are bounded places, and you mentioned the novella as a form that is kind of inspired by this fact. Do you ever think about the negative space, about the stuff around the islands, about the ocean? Because, in a way, the ocean is also often considered a utopian space in that it's free from national claims and dominion, and I wonder about that.
Yeah, that makes me think of your wonderful seasteading novel. And one of the things I was reading about when I worked on the early stages of this book was the sort of libertarian secessionist island strategy that many people attempted. There was one sort of libertarian who tried to build a man-made island far enough off the coast of South Carolina that it would be in international waters and he could therefore do whatever he wanted on it. But then I think the U.S. government redrew the bounds of their ocean territory, and his man-made island was once again within it. So that's just one of the many ways in which these secessionist islands fail. But I think that it's interesting because the model of seasteading, being out on the ocean, it's of absolute freedom from all kinds of laws, freedom from restriction. Whereas I think islands evoke a different sort of relationship. It's that you have to live within your bounds. You have to live within your means. You have to find a way to relate to the people who are also there with you. And so islands do sort of force a type of community on, or a necessity of relation that probably a seasteading ship does as well, but that people try to deny.
Well, yeah, and also this idea that the ocean is a sort of place without history or context is obviously a right-wing libertarian delusion in the first place, right? Yeah. Okay, so now I'm going to open it up. Any questions? There's one in the back there.
Hi, thank you so much for sharing your work. My question is surrounding utopia, and I just was curious, from the beginning of your project to where you are now, has your concept of utopia changed and what you think utopia means?
That's such a good question. Part of the reason I wanted to do this project was because I wanted to be a person who had a sort of felt tactile sense of what my answer to utopia would be, because I wanted to spend my time thinking about it instead of the multiple trash fires that are ongoing all the time. Because I think it's an important question. We have like a vision of utopia that's maybe 1970s tinged and hippie and crunchy, or it's a futuristic AI-generated utopia, and neither of those feel really like livable spaces for the world for me. So I'd say that part of the logic of choosing 5 different stories was try to build each one in a different way. Like, a couple of these stories are funny, a couple of them are not. There's all sorts of emotions and affects that I'm a little bit unfamiliar with as a fiction writer, like sentimentality. Like, I was figuring out, how do I feel about sentimentality, and how can I make a sentimentality that I can root for and feel real about. So one answer, I think, to this question of how I think differently about utopias is that I think in terms of multiplicity. I think that the idea of the totalizing utopia, it's aligned with sort of communist movements, for example, that had their own failures. Like, to make all the world in one image seems like a thing that we recognize now is too complex to do. So I think about pockets of people organizing the way they want to live. I think of pockets of people negotiating these hard questions about how they create more equity, even if they can't achieve total perfection. So I think the thing is always like a flawed utopia, and as Ursula K. Le Guin talked about it, an ambivalent utopia. You can see a way in which this world would be imperfect, and you also know that there is no perfect solution to smooth that all out. We have to live together with each other, but we can live better than we currently do.
There's 2 questions in the front.
Thank you very much for this really, really interesting introduction, and for reading from your upcoming novel. I have a question. I think about the strawberries that you showed us, and this idea that we cannot imagine the end of capitalism. I was always wondering about this, Frederic Jameson, and then Zizek picks it up, and then Mark Fisher picks it up, and it just gets repeated and repeated and repeated, and almost until we believe ourselves that we cannot imagine the end of capitalism. Yes, you show us the strawberries, and we can all imagine how really nice strawberries would actually taste like and what to do. So it is also a utopian idea, maybe, an ambivalent utopia in a dystopia. And yeah, I wanted to ask, because Theresia, you introduced, you said it's brave to call it utopian. So maybe also a question for you, why you said it's brave to call it utopian. Because we have all of these utopias, and they do imagine not only the end of capitalism, but a non-capitalist world, in indigenous fiction, in African-American fiction, Octavia Butler. I was when I saw the strawberries, I was reminded of Darcy Little Badger, who said, what is it? It's easier to, it's safer to go to Mars than it is to go to the supermarket. It kind of changes the perspective. So yeah, I would just want to ask about why is it that we don't dare to imagine utopias or ignore the ones that we have?
I mean, it's such a good question, such a beautiful question also. I think that as I have been writing, I've been thinking a lot about Parable of the Sower, because it's a book that maybe we think of primarily as a dystopian novel, and because many of the events depicted in it have come uncannily to life in some ways. Like I'm thinking about the wildfires across LA, or about the president, the president. But what she also does in that book is she puts forth like a belief system by which her main character lives, and which spreads to other people, and which changes their life. And I think that, you know, increasingly we have an overabundance of dystopian novels, like, and we have an overabundance of dystopian reality. And we need people to do that next step too, which is to try to put something in its place, even if it's not perfect, so that we have, I think, the feeling that we too could put something in place of what we see around us. You know, so that's one part of it. And I think the second thing that your question brings up for me is I feel real ambivalence about the Frederic Jameson, Mark Fisher, whatever quote, because it really draws a perimeter around what's possible, and the way that it's done is striking and feels true. But I think that that perimeter also keeps us from thinking outside of those bounds. You know, it keeps us thinking about what can't be imagined, and how tightly constricted we are by, you know, the shape capitalism imposes on our minds, and it doesn't encourage us to try to find the outside there. I think dystopian fiction in many ways does the same thing. You know, I'm thinking of like Cormac McCarthy's The Road, where a father is traveling a wasteland of American post-disaster landscape with his son. And the people that he meets are terrifying. Like, there are terrifying things in that book, some of which make it into the adaptation, the film adaptation, some of which don't. And as we consume one vision after another of a world that unravels, where civility unravels, where relationship and common, like, human recognition unravels, I think that that kind of becomes what we expect from other people in the case of a disaster. When if you actually look at real disasters like Rebecca Solnit did, you find, like, after the great earthquake of 1917 in San Francisco, people are setting up food kitchens when they don't have a lot of food to spare. There is an instinct to help one another that we hear about a lot less than the ways in which people can turn on all of their civilized behavior. So in some sense, to write novels where dystopian things happen but people react in different ways, I think would help build back into our sense of possibility, you know, and our sense of the world, more of what's actually there, more of the real helpful, altruistic attitude we naturally have for each other. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Many of the utopias I know are closely linked to technological advancements, solving all of our problems. So do you think it's problematic to focus on those and rely on those in a way?
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking of seasteading too. I'm thinking of your seasteading novel, Teresa, where, like, the well-planned out technological systems that are meant to keep everything running smoothly inevitably get older, they come upon obstructions. Like, it feels like complex technological solutions also create complex technological problems to come.
Yeah, and they usually replicate systems that we already live in under. So it's not it's kind of, I think it's kind of foolish to expect the technology to do the utopian work that you're doing through fiction.
Yeah, you know, I think a common tactic among science fiction writers is to imagine an amazing technology that changes the fabric of society. And it's true that technology does do that, but many technologies just extend something like very primitive and very natural that we already have going in our lives. And sometimes they just add an extra layer of it. Like, I mean, thinking about ChatGPT or something, a technology that can help you write an email. We've been able to write an email by ourselves for a long time. So is it really opening something up that's new in the world, or is it just sort of doing what's already been done, but using a lot of clean drinking water in the process?
And can I just go back to that question of why I think it's brave? I think it has to do with this thing that you were saying about sentimentality, and that's something that I think in literature, especially because it's a topic that's also, utopia is a topic that's kind of overburdened by political theory, right? So it's like, so a lot of writers just kind of stay away from it. But I also said that I think that Alex is uniquely qualified to do that, and I think this like change of perspective is in a way like maybe like the right distance that you can still sort of imagine from without it becoming sentimental in this way that we're maybe afraid of.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm driven above all by the desire to surround myself with different ideas than the ones that I think it's easiest, like when things are dark in the world, to make a joke about it, and to stay unhopeful in a way, because what is there to give you a sense of hope? But we need other things to keep us going.
Oh, so many questions. Here. I don't know, you choose.
I had a really quick and easy question. You talked about scurvy, and I'm really interested in scurvy. Have you got any recommendations of books on scurvy?
There is an amazing book about scurvy by Jonathan Lamb, and it's sort of built on his earlier work. He wrote a lot about the preservation of self on long sea voyages, like ways in which civilized sailors were in danger of having their sort of soul or their humanity eroded away by time on the sea, and scurvy was just one little piece of that. But then he zooms into it in a whole book on scurvy.
Thank you, both of you. I'm really grateful for your move to sentimentality and trying to build resilience or envision a future that's kind of our responsibility as writers. And also in thinking about kind of capitalism and what could be, were you thinking about other formal strategies? Like the novel itself is obviously like a technology of capitalism. So were you thinking about like, well, what could I break here? Or what could I open up? Or yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I know, like, it's such a good question, such a good point. Like, I know novels travel the world as these buyable objects, they're commodities. And that is a real facet of their existence. But I also feel like, well, when you're writing a novel, you become very conscious of all of the time that's spent with a novel when it cannot be a commodity, when it is not transferable, when it's shown to no one, where it's a place or an excuse for you to spend time in another world with people who might be close to the people you know, or might be experiments, like meant to extend what you think. They try out thinking things that you would never think, and then you get to see how that feels. So there's a way in which I think like the novel exists first and foremost to me as something other than all of that. And if it would be interesting to write a novel and not let it circulate that way, or make it circulate along other channels. And like, I feel like that might be a really good idea. I had a dream with this book that it would exist in smaller, almost like pamphlet-like things that could be left around or distributed in different ways. They could like break apart. You could have access to just one, or you could maybe find through talking to people the other ones. But then they also got a little long for that, maybe. So you're in the struggle between like intention and then the materiality of it and the fact of what you've written. But I believe so much in the novel and in literature. Like, these things they were my second home, or they were my portable home when I was growing up. I always had to move around. I'd always be on trips. I'd always be, the only child among all adults. And a book was a thing that you could just fall into, and it really felt like another place. It has that magical liberatory quality. So when I've only read from this section one other time, and I think I got a question that was, why do you write this section in the first person? The first person is the I. The I is individualistic. The I is sort of a product and a totem of capitalism and American, put yourself firstness. And I hear that, and I think I've seen it that way in the past. But I think that we are fools to let go of any tool that could be helpful to us. So that an I can be a thing that helps us relate to others. An I in a novel is, it's not you, the self-sufficient, like American Homesteader. It's a little door into someone else that you can be for a little while. And I think that it's much more flexible and much more mobile than it sometimes sounds. So I think a novel can operate in that sort of way too. And it's our job to take these tools that we have and make them do what we want.
Thanks, Alex. That was such a great talk. I really enjoyed it. One argument for dystopian fiction would be that it actually produces this effect in the reader where, you read The Road, you read Clockwork Orange, and you kind of hold your loved ones closer. You don't want to be that kind of evil version that you're reading. And you read utopian fiction, and it can produce the opposite effect, right? It can make you a cynic. It can be like, that would never work. And so I'm curious about how, when you're crafting this kind of utopian fiction, like, how do you avoid cultivating the exact negative thoughts in the reader that you're trying to dispel?
Thanks, Justin. That's such a great question. I mean, I think like one of the things I struggle with was my first impulse when I had this idea was to go and read a bunch of utopian novels to get my bearing again. A lot of them I read when I was in college or when I was in high school. And unfortunately, I discovered that they're not very fun to read. And I think that in the way that they feel like a little surfacey, or the way that they contain like page after page of super expository dialogue that basically just answers like, well, how do you make a legislature that can run a place like this? Well, here's how I do it. It can really make you go, I think utopia is not for me. And I think that dystopias did and probably do have that potential that you point to too, that you can see things happening in front of you that you draw back from and think like, well, if it were the same situation and I were in it, I would not behave that way. But the balance is tilted a little too far in the direction of the dystopia, I think. And I think that like when, for many years, I don't think it's still is because the show has ended, but The Walking Dead was the most popular TV series in the United States. And you just think like, what does it do overall to the national vibe if the majority of people are watching like humans battle other humans with slow, depressing zombies, always a risk. Like, it's shifting how we think of other people in some subtle way, at least. So maybe we need a healthy amount of dystopias, but we also need significantly more representations of how life could be to make us feel like we're doing that navigation. Like, this is who I want to be. This is who I don't want to be. This is who I would be in this situation. But I think the most harmful myth that comes out of dystopias is that, whoever you think you are, some new person is revealed when things go south, and you will behave like the thing you hate. You will do the thing that you think is reprehensible, because I really think we have so much in us that works against that.
There was another question in the front here.
This is amazing talk, thank you. I wanted to ask about your writing process. Since you're writing 5 sections, are they read in order? Are they interwoven? And do you write them in order? Or I would just like to know more about how you're working on it.
Thanks so much for that question. I'm writing these 5 sections. I do think that they are ordered chronologically, because we go from the 18th century to 1940s to 30 years from now, and then to the far future. And it would be really nice, I thought, if I could write them in order, and that would be really practical. But I've done it in the most nonsensical way possible. I started with the one that I read from tonight, because to me, that one, this section really is the utopian novel is seen from the perspective of the person who is giving the tour, with all the friction that involves. And because, as you may have seen from my talk, I've spent most of my career writing in a pretty dissonance space. And so I had to know, if I was going to do this, that I could write something where the feelings are a little bit different, where the feelings are more positive, where there can be, I sometimes felt like it was like knitting a sock from the inside out in total darkness. Like, can I reverse the estrangement techniques that I've really felt comfortable with, and take something that is not our world and make it feel like very normal and a little warm and a little lived in? So I started there, and then from the 4th one, I went to the 3rd one, and then I went to the 2nd one, and now I'm writing the 5th one, and then I'll write the 1st one. And I don't know why it's like this. I would never have chosen it to be this way. But my justification to myself is, part of the reason I wanted to have so many different sort of time periods in here is this idea that we can find useful models and useful things to salvage in the past, that we don't just move forward carrying only, what we have on our backs. We can learn of an interesting new idea from the past, and maybe we can even forget some of the negative baggage that came along with it. We can just take the good part. So to travel in an unusual, intuitive way, I think it is helping me build some connections between them that will make it more cohesive at the end. But it's also sort of mirroring the searching that these characters are doing, looking for examples that can help them figure out what to do in their moment, and maybe finding them and maybe just serving as an example for someone else in a different section.
I think we have time for one more question, and then we're going to have to wrap it up.
Thank you, Hannah.
Okay.
Thank you. Many questions come to mind, but let me just say this. Utopias are meant to be challenging. They're meant to really unsettle the reader, or many readers. And for example, Thomas More wrote Utopia knowing that it was controversial, and he even retracts the whole thing at the end. Has different strategies of dealing with the controversial ideas he's expressing. And that's my question to you. I think your subject lends itself to this question. Do you think the American audience and the European audience is not going to immediately want to end capitalism? So you could potentially have a lot of hostile, critical readers. And I'm just wondering, do you take that, is that part of your writing, or do you have rhetorical strategies or creative strategies to try to transform readers who would be disinclined to agree with some of your ideas, or what? And then I guess what kind of reception, how you want your novel to be received?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a good question, and I think like sometimes when you write, you have the thought of how will this be received, and it's usually not a useful question, a useful thing to be thinking about in terms of actually writing the text.
To most people who could potentially read it, or are you just writing for a small subset of people who are already inclined to accept?
Yeah, well, I think first, like, it would overstate it a little bit to say I'm making points. Like I'm exploring an area that I'm really interested in, that I would be interested in experiencing, you know? So on the one hand, I'm not coming in with a lot of argumentation and a lot of firm ideas about how I think the world should transition, or what exactly I think it should transition to. Like, I know that Thomas More himself he wasn't advocating for a world exactly like he depicts in Utopia. You know, some of his personal views are in there, and some things that you think he would probably disagree with as an ardent Catholic are also in there. You know, and I think it would sort of be the death of a novel if the novel were simply everything you believe about the world put into like a very loose narrative frame. You know, so like my aim in each of these is to, you know, make alterations to the world and then just see what it's like to live in there. Like the fact that the storyline has a sort of spatiality or maybe realness, or that you can maybe spend some time in it or get lost in it for a little bit, that is more than anything my aim. Because I think the idea of utopia has been set back by so many things, from excesses of regimes to some pretty clunky novels. And I think to just think of it as a type of story you could write into, a type of world you could inhabit for a while, and a thing that is not so far out of reach and pie in the sky would be my only idea. And I think it's a pretty capacious idea. As for how people will respond to it, like I think no one has to read a book, but I think that if you well, but I think everyone has a curiosity too about other ways to live. Like I think, you know, we don't read science fiction novels because we want to live in the world that's depicted for the most part. You know, it's a curiosity about other ways that we could be that allows us to feel the loosening of like the way that things currently are around us. You know, so I don't know for sure what people will think, but I just write the book. Yeah.